How do you read a book that doesn't have punctuation and that doesn't even have spacing between characters? So if you check out my Dream of the Red Chamber blog at redchamber.blog, you'll notice something. See, I've been inserting screenshots from a scan of an original print of Hong Lo Meng, or Dream of the Red Chamber. And even if you don't read Chinese, you'll notice that there's something unusual about this text. So the real unusual thing here is the complete lack of punctuation. Well, there's mostly a lack of punctuation. There are a few ink marks in a few parts of the text, but there's not really much. In fact, the reason why I chose this particular copy of the original printing of the text is because it's so clean. But let's take a look at the history of the text itself first. There are actually numerous early versions of Hong Lo Meng, Dream of the Red Chamber, some of which date as far back as 1754, and they're handwritten. So these handwritten copies are the basis behind the critical study of the novel, something that really didn't start up until the 1920s when China was struggling with the problems of modernization. Anyway, if you look closely at these old versions, you'll notice two things. The first is that there really is no punctuation, nothing to tell you where sentences start and stop. And the second thing is all of this really odd red text. Okay, let's talk first a little bit about that red text. That red ink comes from the famous Zhi Yanzhai, whose name translates to English as red inkstone. It's not clear if Zhi Yanzhai was one person, multiple people, a relative of author Cao Shuiqin, or even Cao Shuiqin himself. What is clear, though, is that this person had a lot of deep knowledge about the structure of the novel, as well as some real-life events that would have otherwise been lost if we didn't have this commentary. Dig deep enough into the world of Zhi Yanzhai, and you too can be a so-called redologist or a scholar who has mastered Dream of the Red Chamber. Now, most people who talk about this book get really excited about Zhi Yanzhai, and it makes sense, right? I mean, we basically have like editor notes and a number of original manuscripts, and those notes reveal all sorts of crazy things about this famous novel. But on the other hand, it's really not fair to readers who are not already familiar with the book to jump straight into that level of literary criticism. That's the reason why I haven't spent a lot of time so far talking about Zhi Yanzhai and all the textual variants. We're going through the book as published first in 1792, and then we'll come back to all this juicy and confusing stuff. Now let's move on to the lack of pronunciation, which is the more interesting part. Classical Chinese texts were originally transmitted without any punctuation at all. In fact, in an interesting way, the written language itself was designed to overcome this lack of punctuation. So this was originally done by using various particles which would help separate phrases and sentences from each other. I'll give you an example of a couple of them that come from classical Chinese. For example, hu is the old question particle, kind of the Chinese equivalent of a question mark, except it has a pronunciation. You'll see it in places like this famous phrase from the Confucian Analects, "You peng zi yuan fang lai, bu yi le hu," or "Isn't it wonderful to have friends from faraway places?" You'll see the who at the end of that sentence. It shows that the whole sentence is done and that it's a question. And remember that the comma there is a modern interpolation. Anyway, if you know some modern Chinese, who is the classical form of the modern ma. Now, interestingly enough, East Asian languages that were influenced by Chinese use similar things. Look at Korean, for example. In formal Korean, you'll see a sentence like this, "Kusalamu manago shipsimnika," which means, "Do you want to meet that person?" So in this sentence, ka serves as the question particle. In less formal Korean, you might hear a sentence like this, "Maome de ni," which means, "Do you like it?" In this sentence, the question particle is ni, but it's the same grammatical idea as who in the classical Chinese or ma in modern Chinese. Japanese uses ka. So if you see a sentence like "Nanji ni tabemashita ka," the ka at the end is the question particle. And in Vietnamese, you would use hong, and please pardon my bad pronunciation there, I'm still learning. There's no coincidence there, by the way. Actually, if you know your way around classical Chinese, it becomes a little bit easier to learn Chinese dialects as well as languages influenced by a classical Chinese such as Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, and so on. Now, you do have to worry about crazy pronunciation and impossible tone rules, but at least some of the language will make a little more sense to you. Another sentence-ending particle that kind of works almost like punctuation is the word ye, which is the sentence final particle. We call this the copula, which means a word that links the subject of the sentence with the predicate, usually an adjective, but sometimes also a noun. Think of ye as the equivalent of to be or even as an equal sign. Okay, we'll check out an example sentence here from the Shunzi. 君者周也, 书人者水也. It means the ruler is like a boat and the common people are like the water. And remember, there's no punctuation in the original. In this sentence, the two phrases have two things in common. The first thing is 着, which is used to mark a noun as the topic of the sentence, and this sentence will involve saying what those nouns are or mean or are like. And the second is 也, or that equals sign. So if we look at the sentence one piece at a time, we can figure this out. 君 means ruler, and 君者 also means ruler, but the 着 tells us that it's the topic of the sentence or that it's been marked off for special emphasis. 舟 means boat, and then 也 comes right after 舟. Looking at those four characters in context, it makes sense. The ruler is a boat, or if you want the translation to make sense, the ruler is like a boat. Now, in the second part of that sentence, we see 着 and 也 make their triumphant returns. 庶人 means the common people, and 着 is a topic marking particle showing that 庶人, the common people, is the topic of this sentence, clause, or whatever you want to think about it as. 水 means water, and there's that equal sign again, 也. The common people are not literally water, so we say that they're like water. Anyway, we could do this all day long, but notice how the parallel structure works to divide the sentence up into parts that are recognizable. That's the way that you would read text in China before there was punctuation. Now, that's not to say that you won't find any punctuation in old copies. It's there, though it's usually handwritten. The hard thing, though, is figuring out how to decipher it. So these old annotations are called judo and usually were used to mark stops in the text to aid with reading. But the problem with these judo annotations is that it's not always clear what they meant. Sometimes you can see that it marks the end of a phrase or a sentence, but sometimes it's as clear as mud, and that of course can be problematic. Okay, so take this line of text for example from a recent post that I made in chapter 4. 当下言不着语村且说那买来应连打死, and then up to the next line. The trick here is figuring out where one sentence ends and the other one begins. Now, if you're already familiar with literary Chinese technique, you'll know that 且说 is probably where the new sentence begins. So 且说 means something like let's now turn to or let's now talk about. It's a pretty common verb in older books used to change emphasis to a new subject. But if you didn't know that, the whole thing would look like a massive run-on sentence. Well, there are two ways that we can solve this problem. So the first is to read a modern punctuated version of the book. But if you do that, you have to keep in mind that there might be mistakes or there might be some old and wrong tradition that was carried over. Sometimes books with commentary can help, that is, older books, since the commentary breaks in where the phrases end. And the second way, unfortunately, is to just know the context. So if we know the context of this section, we know that Yu Cun refers to Jia Yu Cun, who we were just talking about. Because of that, 当下言不着语村, or let's not talk about Yu Cun anymore for now, is almost certainly a complete sentence just by itself. But as you can see, Chinese, like the other East Asian languages, is really context heavy. It's one of those things where you can see what's going on if you know the whole context, but if you've got no idea of what the context is behind this phrase, this sentence, this book, whatever, it's going to be really hard to crack the puzzle. Now, I've got one more example for you, and hopefully one that's a little bit less boring. So, you see, you can look for parallel structures to figure out where the pauses really need to go. Alright, here we go. So when Jia Baoyu first sees Lin Dayu, she's described like this. 两万四处飞出龙眼妹一双四溪飞溪含情目台生两叶, and then on to the next line. Now, if we zoom back to the whole page or this section of the page, we can clearly see that this is a poem since it's been demarcated in the text. It starts two characters down from everything else. And you know, that's one reason to look at the original text, by the way. So these modern books don't always format things that way. Fortunately, this one, which is from Taiwan, does, but there are versions I've seen that don't. Now, the way to solve this puzzle is to look for parallel structures. Here it is a combination of si and fei, which means looks like something but is not something. Si cu, fei cu, and si xi, fei xi are therefore parallel structures, seemingly frowning but not frowning, and seemingly happy but not happy. Now, when you look in front of those phrases, you'll see another parallel structure, Liang Wan and Yi Shuang, which is one number and one so-called measure word. And then at the end, you've got Long Yan Mei and Han Qing Mu. Mei, eyebrows, and Mu, eyes, are both common nouns. They both deal with the eyes, and you can see that they have that eye radical, that eye symbol together. Long Yan is an adjectival phrase. It's shrouded in smoke. And Han Qing is similarly an adjectival phrase, filled with emotion or filled with qing. So when you look at the whole line again, you can see that these two parts here go together because of the parallel structure. The rest of the part down here is a new part, a new line of the poem. Anyway, that was a little bit long-winded, but it's the other way that you solve that problem of interpretation when there's no punctuation at all. So parallel structure is an important thing to understand, especially when you try to figure out poetry. Now, it can be rough because things like nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, the parts of speech, they tend to change their grammatical function based on the context of the sentence or the context of the poem. That can be hard. Anyway, that's it for today.